So again, we go to the compassion wing for practice in this session. So we said that the foundation is ethics, and on that basis we engage in the concentration practice or the Shamatha practice. And on that basis we engage in the wisdom or Vipashyana practice. But we need to balance that wisdom with compassion. And we often have this analogy of they're like two wings of a bird, that if a bird wants to fly somewhere, it needs two wings. Similarly, if we want to move along the spiritual path, we need both wings. And in Sanskrit, these are called prajna and upaya. Prajna is wisdom. And upaya is often translated as method or skillful means. And of course, the foundation of method or skillful means is the motivation of compassion. So often this is called the compassion wing of practice. Now, we need to practice both. Otherwise, it's like a bird trying to fly with one wing. It sort of doesn't go very well. And that's what sometimes we see in spiritual practice is people often gravitate towards one of those wings and sort of neglect the other wing, and they end up in difficulties. You know, because in Buddhism there's a lot of talk about Vipashyana and wisdom and so forth, and so people can often put a lot of effort into this. And on the basis of that we need some Shamatha, so people put a lot of effort into Shamatha and Vipashyana. But then what can happen is, due to the nature of those practices, we can become very self-absorbed, we can become very disconnected from the world, even to the point of being insensitive to the sufferings of others, and in very extreme cases become completely unethical. Because in extreme cases, if people are doing this Vipashyana practice and having some sorts of experiences, then they often deludedly think there's some high level on the path, and therefore everything I do is with wisdom, therefore everything I do is okay, and they become completely unethical. And unfortunately we see this quite a lot in the modern world. But equally well, sometimes people gravitate to the compassion wing of practice and neglect the wisdom wing, and then often find themselves in difficulties as well. For example, if we neglect the wisdom wing, then our compassion can become very biased. I'll help these people because they're nice people, but these horrible, nasty people over here, I'm not going to help them. In fact, I hope they suffer. They deserve to suffer. And then also, even if we have the best intention in the world, if we don't have wisdom, then we can often end up doing things that not only don't help, but just create more suffering. And then, of course, what we often see as well is that particularly people who are full of enthusiasm and full of compassion and want to go out and make a difference in the world, aid workers, social workers and so forth, go out and then within 3 to 6 months compassion burnout. Of course we saw that that's actually empathy burnout, but it's still the same aspect. And so of course that's a classic example of compassion with lacking wisdom. And the wisdom there of course is knowing what we can do to help, what we can't do to help, and of course the wisdom of knowing when to rest and look after ourselves. Because if we allow ourselves to be burnt out, then we're no use to anyone. And then the last one I think I've already mentioned, but this is something that I think we've all experienced many occasions, is we try to help someone and they take advantage of us. And so again, that's a classic example of compassion without wisdom. Because if we allow people to take advantage of us, if we're trying to help them, then we're in some ways encouraging them to behave badly. And so that's the opposite of compassion. So therefore the wisdom there would be to not tolerate that behaviour, not allow that. So therefore we really need to work on these two wings of practice. And of course, at our level, we work on them individually. And each one will support and enhance the other. But as we're going to see a little bit later, actually, they're two aspects of the same thing. But at our level, we need to work on them individually. And what we've seen a little bit already is that we have these two wings of practice in both the Theravada Buddhist traditions and the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. And I'll talk a little bit more about the differences between those two major sides of Buddhism in this evening session. And so what we saw when we looked at the compassion wing, remember the foundation of that were these four immeasurables, and so that we find at the foundation level, the Theravada level. And in the Mahayana, we saw there briefly yesterday that we build on that to this aspiration of bodhicitta. And we've just started looking at the wisdom wing, the Vipashyana wing. And we saw there briefly this morning that at the foundation level, when we're practicing Vipashyana, we're working on these three insights of impermanence, suffering and no self. These are called the three marks of existence. And so this forms the core of the wisdom wing within Theravada. And in the Mahayana, again, we build on those three marks of existence to this wisdom of emptiness. So this is what the two wings of wisdom and compassion look like in the Theravada and the Mahayana traditions. And so, of course, today we're starting to look at this in terms of impermanence, and then this evening we'll start to touch on the second one, the suffering, and then tomorrow morning the no self. And of course, we have covered the four immeasurables over the previous days, and this emptiness we'll start to look at a little bit later tomorrow. And of course, the bodhicitta we started to look at yesterday, and I want to continue with that today in the session now. Any questions about that? Yeah.
Is there a practice that combines both of them?
Both?
Compassion and wisdom?
Combine.
I'm asking because I want to understand, sometimes when I do Glen, especially when I do it on myself, I kind of start to analyze the emotions and go down and like what causing them. And sometimes I get, it's like opening a wound. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I get to memories from childhood, and it takes courage. But then when I really see the origin, a lot of compassion arises.
Yeah. So then, of course, that analysis would be mainly a type of Vipashyana practice because we're investigating. Of course, a little bit different to the investigations we're doing here, but that's still a Vipashyana type of practice. And then through coming to that insight, then compassion arises. In fact, that's what we're going to see, particularly with this emptiness, is that through doing the emptiness practice, we come to an insight. From that, spontaneously, compassion will arise, in fact. Because again, they're not two separate things. That actually what we find is that compassion is the natural expression of wisdom. But for that to happen, of course we need the wisdom. But then people say, well, why do I need to work on compassion now? I just need to work on wisdom. When I get there, compassion will naturally come. That may be true, but while we're working on wisdom, if we don't work on compassion, the mental afflictions are going to torpedo our Vipashyana practice. So we need to use some compassion to subdue them a bit and to make sure that that wisdom practice is heading in a healthy direction and not going over here. So we need to work on them separately, balanced initially. But yes, so that can happen.
It's a combination. Okay.
So yes, you can, through doing particularly a Vipashyana practice, to come to some insight. From that, we can have these sorts of things arising, yes. And also, of course, often compassion practice involves some investigation, like seeing the sufferings of others and seeing why that's the case, and then compassion arises. So that would be really the compassion practice. Okay. So just to add a few things to this bodhicitta. So remember yesterday we said bodhicitta is a Sanskrit word. Bodhi is enlightenment, chitta is mind. So literally it's the mind of enlightenment. And it's defined simply as the mind that aspires to enlightenment for the benefit of others. So we actually have two aspirations in bodhicitta. One aspiration is for enlightenment herself, and the other aspiration is to help to liberate everyone from suffering. And we saw there yesterday that there are two main methods that were used or taught historically to cultivate bodhicitta. The first one was that 7 cause and effect method we looked at briefly. And then we spent a bit more time on the second method, the equalising and exchanging self with others. That was those 5 steps of equalising self with others, reflecting on the disadvantages of self-cherishing, the advantages of cherishing others, then exchanging self with others, exchanging self-cherishing with the mind of cherishing others, and then that meditative practice of Tonglen. And of course, we're going to do another Tonglen practice shortly, but before that, a few more things to say. In terms of how we approach this cultivating bodhicitta, there are often 3 sort of approaches that are mentioned. The first one is king-like bodhicitta, and that is the perspective that, like a king leads his people, I'm going to get to enlightenment and then bring everyone to enlightenment. The second approach is boatman-like, where we're in a boat with other people and we're navigating the boat. So that attitude is, I'm going to bring everyone with me to enlightenment together. And then there's the shepherd-like bodhicitta, who the shepherd goes behind the flock, herding the flock home. And so the shepherd-like bodhicitta is the attitude, I'm going to first bring everyone to enlightenment, then I'm going to come to enlightenment. So which one of those attitudes would be the most powerful?
King-like.
The shepherd.
Going to the other shore.
Depends on the person.
Probably the second, so then you have enough wisdom, so you're not shepherd-like, but...
Depends on the person.
The shepherd, because
The third one. Of course, we can't do it, but having that attitude is the most altruistic. So if we have the shepherd-like, we'll become like the king. Because we want everyone else to be first. And that attitude will mean we will get to enlightenment faster.
And that's not practical. But
It's not practical.
Yes,
What's not practical?
this aspiration. It's not going to happen, so it's kind of weird to aspire for that.
No. But again, it's really all to do with putting others first.
That's okay.
Right.
But not as far as enlightenment.
And of course, you will never put others' enlightenment before you, but if you have that aspiration of putting others first, that is going to really be very strong in eliminating any selfishness. And therefore, you will go faster to enlightenment.
On my way.
And then often we talk about two types of bodhicitta. There is what's called aspiring bodhicitta and engaging bodhicitta. And to know the difference between those two, it's like the analogy, if we want to go somewhere, first we have to have the aspiration to go there, otherwise we'll never go there. But then of course to get there, we actually need to go. So this is wanting to go, this is going. So aspiring bodhicitta is simply that aspiration for enlightenment. Engaging bodhicitta is taking actual steps towards enlightenment. And we do this through these, and we'll look at this this evening or tomorrow, what's called the 6 perfections, these 6 perfections practices. So this is like sequential. First we have the aspiration, then we take steps towards enlightenment. And so what we've seen here also is that this aspiration of bodhicitta is the door of entry into the path to enlightenment. So in Buddhism we can talk about a number of doors of entry. So I thought it might be useful to mention that, to make that clear. And often the first door of entry that is mentioned is the door of entry into the Dharma being the Buddhist system. And the door of entry into the Dharma is said to be the when we take refuge. And refuge here is talking about refuge into what's called the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And the analogy here is a little bit like the analogy we had earlier about the physical illness. Now, if we're sick, who or what do we turn to? Who do we turn to for refuge from suffering? Usually the doctor. Why? Because we believe that the doctor is qualified not only to diagnose what our problem is, but hopefully cure us. But then, of course, the actual refuge from suffering is not the doctor, but the medicine that they give us. And sometimes when to be cured, we may need to have an operation in hospital and we need to recover. And then it's often the nurses that help with that recovery. So, just like we turn to refuge to the doctor, medicine and nurses for when we're sick, similarly here, who or what can we turn to for refuge for our suffering, mental or physical, particularly mental suffering, is we turn to refuge to the Buddha because we believe or have confidence that the Buddha is qualified to help us. And of course the actual refuge is the teachings of the Buddha, that we have confidence that those teachings are really going to help us. And then also what's going to help us to take that, to implement those teachings, is the spiritual community, the Sangha, who are following those teachings. So when we have faith and confidence that the Buddha, his teachings and that spiritual community really can help us, then we have entered into the Dharma, the Buddhist path in general. But then, of course, to actually enter into the path to liberation from suffering, and of course this is the goal of the Theravada system of Buddhism, is what's called renunciation. And this is a classic example of how terminology can be very confusing. In fact, this word here is not a good translation. Because here, this renunciation is the door of entry into the path to liberation. But when this is explained, often people go, "Ooh, I'm not sure I really want to enter the Buddhist path." Because it seems like this renunciation, which of course renounce means to give up, it seems to imply that I need to give up money, pleasure, wealth, fame and good reputation. Because isn't that what renunciation means? To give up all of those things? Absolutely not. Of course the word renunciation means to give up, but we're not talking about giving up wealth, pleasure, praise, reputation, fame and so forth. What we're talking about here is giving up an unhealthy attitude to those things. The attitude that those things are the source of my happiness, that money, wealth, pleasure, they are going to make me happy. That's what renunciation is about. To understand that the real source of happiness lies within. That's what renunciation means, but still that's not a very good translation. Because here, the original Sanskrit term is nisarana. ni, the prefix ni means out of, away from. Sarana means to move, to go. So ni sarana means the wish or aspiration to move out of, away from suffering to liberation. So actually the original word means the wish for liberation from suffering. Whereas renunciation doesn't really have that meaning. So whenever you see the word renunciation, that's what we're talking about. Not about giving up things, but actually it's really the wish for liberation from suffering. So that, of course, is the door of entry into the path to liberation, to nirvana. But of course here in the Mahayana, where the final goal of the path in the Mahayana is not just nirvana but enlightenment, and we'll look at tomorrow or the next day the difference between those two. And of course the door of entry into the Mahayana path to enlightenment is when we cultivate the wish for enlightenment, of course, bodhicitta. But then we can also talk about the door of entry into Vipashyana or Tantra, and again, I think tomorrow morning we'll look at a little bit more what Vipashyana or Tantra really is all about. But the door of entry into that vehicle is empowerment. Empowerment means, another word, initiation. We get introduced to a particular practice. So that is what empowerment means. But again, tomorrow morning I'll talk more about that. So I'll just list it there because it's one of the doors of entry. So these are the various doors of entry. And of course, now at the moment we're talking about this bodhicitta. But what we can see here is that if we really want this, first we need to have renunciation. And if we really want renunciation, we really need to have faith and confidence that all of this stuff is going to help us. Otherwise, we're never going to cultivate these. So we can see this as like a step by step. And if we want the door of entry empowerment, then of course we need the bodhicitta. So these are levels. And we'll talk more about this last one tomorrow morning. We'll introduce that a little bit more. Any questions about that? Because then I'll go back now to the bodhicitta.
I have a question. You got the last year, but I want to know now. Where else is Mahayana Buddhism besides Tibet?
Yeah, that's one of the topics for this evening, but very briefly, the Mahayana Buddhism is the Buddhism that's practiced in China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and also Mongolia. And probably there's some small Russian ex-republics that are also Mahayana. But that's sort of roughly the Mahayana territory.
And then Theravada?
Theravada would be then Sri Lanka.